Is it our moral duty to help others? Welcome to an original exploration of everyday moral dilemmas with philosopher Dr. Clancy Martin and spiritual guide Daaji. Human beings are social animals. We live in communities, families, and groups, so helping each other should be a no-brainer. It is better for us as well as the group. One would think that a difference of opinion would only arise as to the extent of helping another person. However, down the ages, many thought leaders have held the opinion that the idea of helping another person is flawed in itself.
One very popular advocate of this idea is the American philosopher Ayn Rand, who champions egoism using the ideas of some 19th century economists and philosophers. And the idea is that, if I promote my own good interest and leave others alone to promote their own good interests as well, and we don't interfere with one another, all of us will sort of collectively rise. And this view, though it's not always stated so explicitly, and because it also gets mixed in with a certain kind of notion of thinking, a way of thinking about democracy, that is one person, one vote expressing her preferences. When you take democracy, capitalism, and an egoistic version of utilitarianism and mix them all together, you get something very much like the prevailing world philosophy that we sort of have today, which is that, again, even if we're not explicit about it, we very often have this tendency to think that, okay, I should just seek what's best for me, maybe me and mine, my family, and let other people seek their own particular good.
And while many of us may actually live our lives guided by this philosophy, we seem to express the opposite opinion. We talk about compassion, charity, and helping others, and we seem to assign a great deal of importance to these values. We speak in glowing terms of a person's selfless action. Should we really just be looking out for ourselves, or should we also be looking out for others?
What can I say? Should I give this answer in black and white, or with one sentence? That there is always individual flourishing that leads to partial or full group flourishing. It is the individual peace that can possibly have impact on universal peace. I often get bombarded with questions like, when you meditate, is it not selfish to have your own spiritual gain? My response is always that until I am equipped with necessary know-how, I cannot assist others. Self-enablement is a must before we can assist others. Isn't it?
But at what stage can we consider ourselves enabled to help others? When are we flourishing enough to contribute to the larger community?
When we talk about human flourishing, from what level are we talking? What sort of flourishing? Is it physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual flourishing? In Sanatana Dharma, ancient Hindu culture, the 4 fundamental prayers were offered based on the 4 fundamental needs of a human being. Number 1 being artha, dharma, kama, moksha. These are Sanskrit words. But simply understood, they are all about your financial fulfillment, righteousness fulfillment, emotional fulfillment, and spiritual fulfillment.
However, beyond our needs, are we hardwired to sympathize with others? In this regard, Dr. Clancy points to the work of the Chinese philosopher Mencius,
a Neo-Confucian philosopher, a great Chinese philosopher who pointed out to us, as I mentioned before, that sympathy for one's fellow human being is fundamental to who we are. Mencius gives the example of a couple who have lost a child because the child is drowned in a well. And Mencius points out that any ordinary human being, a human being who hasn't, say, been distorted by horrible experiences or something like this, but any kind of normal, typical, ordinary human being will immediately feel sympathy for that couple. Our hearts will go out to that couple. We'll experience a little taste of their suffering. Not at all the same measure of suffering as they experience, but our hearts will go out to them. We'll feel like, oh, those poor people, they lost that child. And for Mencius, this settles the question of, really fundamentally settles the question of how human beings feel towards each other, how we ought to treat each other, that we have this kind of deeper respect and care for each other that is fundamental to who we are and is fundamental to our flourishing.
Let's talk of science. Mirror neurons. It's a new frontier in science today which says why we feel empathetic with other people. When you see someone suffering, you react and feel inclined to empathize. That is explained by these mirror neurons firing in our nervous system. It is as if the brain at some level does not recognize the difference between the self and the others. We are in fact hardwired to have a compassionate response to others. Have you noticed how the entire nervous system reacts when we see sights where there are emotionally powerful moments happening around us? Our hearts expand. There is a constriction in the throat. Our eyes fill with tears and we feel moved. The endorphins are released in our bloodstream when we hear stories of heroism and bravery, of generosity and love. We are meant to take care of each other, to thrive as a community.
The great 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote a paper about this, and he asked this question: how is it that one human being could sacrifice her life for another human being? Think of the case. This is a classic case in utilitarian philosophy as it's developed in the 20th, 21st centuries. Think of the case of a soldier she's in a Humvee. Suddenly an IED, an improvised explosive device, gets thrown into the Humvee, and she recognizes that she can either throw herself on the IED and save the lives of her 4 fellow soldiers in the Humvee, or she can do nothing and all of them are going to die, or she can jump out of the Humvee and she'll save her own life, and what happens with her to her fellow soldiers, she doesn't know. Maybe they're able to get out, maybe they're not. What does she do? And Schopenhauer thinks, and a lot of people in the history of philosophical thought about this subject have thought that not only is it the right thing for her to throw herself on top of the IED, guaranteeing the lives of her compatriots, her fellow soldiers, but also that it is kind of the instinctive thing to do, that she would sort of naturally, or many people may naturally be inclined to do this incredible, heroic thing, sacrificing one's own life for the life of one's fellow being, or in this case, fellow beings. How could this be? Schopenhauer pointed out that our notion of separation from each other is really contingent upon this idea that we are individuals. That the notion of me being separate from you, you being separate from me, each of us being separate, is tied to the idea that somehow or other I am an individual and you are an individual. But that idea, he points out, is tied in with concepts like time and cause and effect. So part of my idea of my individuality is that I can cause certain things to happen. Part of your idea of your individuality is you can cause certain things to happen, and those things are different things than what I can cause. And furthermore, it's connected with time, principally because of memory. I remember different things than you remember. But Schopenhauer points out, and here again he's relying on some ideas of Immanuel Kant's and some ideas from Buddhism. Ideas like time, and even ideas like cause and effect, look like those are structures superimposed on the human brain by our experience to make sense of our experience. And in fact, when we look at contemporary cognitive science, and also the intersection of contemporary physics with cognitive science, we find almost universal agreement that it's true that the way we human beings experience things is a kind of superimposition created by our brain to make sense of a universe in the way that we happen to make sense of it right now. And that may even be a historical thing. It could be that our brain changes over the course of history. Another philosopher, 19th century philosopher, in fact influenced by Kant, a great philosopher named George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, argued this view, that the way we construct experience changes over the course of history. But if we follow along with Kant and a certain understanding of Buddhism and Schopenhauer when thinking that our notion of our separateness is contingent upon these superimposed ideas of time and causality, and that these things are not really real, then we aren't really separate from one another. We just have this, we're kind of operating with this functional illusion of separation, functional illusion of individuality. And if that's true, then suddenly the idea of me being willing to sacrifice myself for you, or the soldier being willing to sacrifice herself for her fellow soldiers in the Humvee, isn't strange at all. Because in fact, we're not sacrificing any of us individually for another individual. We're sort of collectively participating in an effort that in a way is not exactly self-preservation, but it is a respect for the thing which we all collectively are.
Look at quantum science's discovery of all of creation as a seamless fabric of the universal field. We are not separate. It stemmed from an experiment that baffled even Einstein. He called it spooky action at a distance. It had to do with two electrons that had been in connection with one another and then went off at infinite distances. If the spin of one electron changed, the spin of the other electron would change at the same time. There was no known mechanism for that because the time element was not explainable in this case. How can something like this happen at the exact same moment? This in quantum field is called quantum entanglement. Cause and effect in a time frame is thus relegated to an outdated Newtonian classical science model. We are now stepping into a different model with quantum physics that now joins hands with mystical experiences that frame the basis of yoga. It is as if science is finally catching up and saying, yes, the philosophy founded on intuition achieved by experience born in traditions of India, had it right. Our collective thought patterns, our feelings, they form an egregore. Let's try and understand what this egregore is. When you visit a funeral home or a hospital, you develop a certain level of mood. When you visit a kindergarten, you have a different mood. When you go to a baseball stadium or a cricket ground or a football stadium, you have a different, mood. Your state of mind, your emotions are different in each place. This field of feelings created by so many people coming together with a similar mindset, it's egregore. It is like a huge collective cloud, the sum total of all of us. It only shows that we all are connected at multiple levels, intellectually, morally, and spiritually.
If life is one large continuum, how do we explain the experience of life as individual entities? We all commonly experience life as individuals.
The fact remains that we are all individuals with specific identity. It doesn't get lost. It always remains with us. Dissolution of individuality or identity is not a welcome thought, actually. That will be anti-evolutionary. When we talk of existence of two electrons, for example, interconnected in a quantum field, that does not deny the possibility of individual existence of each electron, but for sure they're connected. Our individuality is also connected. In the background, we hardly understand. This background is quantum infinity. Just as the waves in the oceans are part of the ocean, yet they're very specific with their heights, their intensity, their speed, the volume. Similarly, the light waves that emanate from a light object, or the source of object of this light. We are also being supported individually by that infinite quantum field. Our individuality, our identity is always unique.
Even if we experience life as individuals connected by an underlying reality, how do we decide who has the responsibility of helping another?
There's a famous story told by a really good business leader and business ethicist named Bowen McCoy. It's called The Parable of the Sadhu. And in The Parable of the Sadhu, what happens is groups of hikers are trying to get up Mount Everest. Mountain climbers are trying to get up Mount Everest. And on the way, there's a sadhu. He looks like he is freezing to death. He doesn't have food. He's extremely skinny. He doesn't have sufficient clothes. How he's wound up at this height, no one can figure out, but he clearly needs help. But, and this is a true story, what happens in the parable of the sadhu is that each group of hikers decides, oh well, the next group of mountain climbers will surely help him. We're in a hurry to reach the summit, and weather conditions are changing, etc. And in the story that actually happens, he kind of gets passed from one group to another, the sadhu does, and then nobody really knows what happens to him, but they think that probably he died. And clearly something has gone morally wrong here. And there's a separate story we can talk about that we don't have to talk about today, about shifting responsibility to others rather than taking responsibility for oneself. And there's some other famous stories that I'm sure we will have some time to get around to talking about. But the other lesson that I want to point out in today's talk from the parable of the sadhu, and is widely discussed in the literature on this parable, is we don't really know what the sadhu wanted. We assume that the sadhu wanted proper clothing, wanted food, wanted to be carried to safety, but we don't actually know that that's the case. And the sadhu was so enfeebled that apparently he couldn't really explain his wishes to those around him. All that we know from the story is that when dogs were approaching him, he was strong enough to throw stones to scare away the dogs. But other than that, no one was really clear on what the sadhu's wishes actually were. And this problem of knowing how best to help others is often used particularly by egoists, by people who think we should all just seek our own best interests, to illustrate how complicated it becomes once we recognize that the well-being of others is included in our own well-being, or if we suppose that the well-being of others is included in our own well-being. Because it is hard to know, isn't it? Even with our own family members, sometimes with our own children, we say, well, I just know that this is better for you. There's a wonderful Cat Stevens song about father and son, and the father and the son are having the debate, and the father is telling the son, find a partner, settle down, you could marry, look at me, I'm old but I'm happy. And the son is saying, no, I know there's something out there that I need, and it's not that, it's not settling down, there's something calling me. And we want to be able to get into each other's heads sometimes and even control, because we think we know what's best for them, and so often we don't know what's best for each other. So this is a real problem when it comes to our duties to help each other, something that we have to think about and wrestle with.
In such a dilemma, many of us fall back on the so-called golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
And another principle is there. Don't do unto others that you would not like to be done unto you. First is golden rule, second is silver rule, because one is positive, another has a negative approach. It's beautiful though.
But this again is subjective. People don't think in the same way, so how can we be sure that which I want done unto myself and that which someone else wants done unto themselves is going to be the same? Is there any basic nature that we all share?
Love is our basic nature. It flows naturally from our heart.
A consciousness that is imbued with love may indeed be a good guide to help us help others. But how can one cultivate such a consciousness? Perhaps being grounded in the interconnectedness of all creation is the way forward. But how does one do that? Daaji offers a suggestion.
In my meditative state, I find stillness that leads to peace, that translate eventually as harmony and oneness. This is an experiential thing actually. Every single day and each moment, if we so train ourselves, we can really stay in that interconnectedness. And it's possible with just 10-15 minutes of meditation.
Thank you, Daaji, and thank you, Dr. Clancy Martin, for those valuable insights into this fascinating topic. Thank you also to our listeners and viewers for joining us. Do join us again for the next episode of Compass. Until then, goodbye.